Welcome back to Sputnik. Last August, poor Harry Dunn was riding his motorcycle down the proper side of the road. He was aged just 19. He grew no older because he was struck by a motor car being driven up the wrong side of the road by an American official called Ann Sekulas. The rest will not be history until justice and closure is achieved. At least that's the view of poor Harry's parents and their redoubtable spokesperson, Mr. Rad Saiga, one of the best spokespersons for any cause I've come across in recent years, and I'm glad to say he joins us now. Rad, congratulations, first of all, in the way in which the family, with you as their spokesman, have kept this issue alive. Poor Harry would have been 20, around about now. He's dead, but not forgotten, and he easily could have been. Tell us what happened that fateful day, and where are we now on the Harry Dunn saga?
Sure, well, you described it perfectly in your introduction, George. He was passionate about riding motorcycles, and that day, August 27th, in the evening, he was minding in his own business, riding his bike perfectly safely, when, as you say, he came into collision with a car being driven by Ann Sekulas, who had turned out of RAF Croughton onto the wrong side of the road, traveled for about half a mile, and struck him. Didn't kill him outright. He laid dying in a ditch next to the road for over 40 minutes, bleeding out. Managed to make it to the hospital, but sadly not in time for his mother to say goodbye to him. She missed him by 3 minutes. So imagine, as his 20th birthday is coming up, the pain that she goes through every day, not being able to comfort him or even say goodbye to him. Where we're up to today is much closer to getting justice for Harry, which was always the objective, than we were in those early days and weeks after he died, when the authorities on both sides of the Atlantic, the disgraceful people that they are, did their level best to bury Harry away and tell the parents that they had no chance of having anybody held accountable for his loss. I'm only involved in this, George, because I've known Harry since he was 2 years old. I live about 200 yards down the road from this family. I happen to be a lawyer who's retired. And I had heard rumors in the community that Ann Sekulas, we didn't know her name at the time, had fled, but I didn't interfere. I simply waited until after the funeral, and the rumors started to swirl more and more, and I knocked on their door on the 28th of September. So roughly 4 weeks after Harry died, and they pulled me in faster than I've ever been pulled into a house before and said help, because they had just been told that she had gone, and they might as well forget any pursuit of justice.
How could that be? How could someone involved in a road traffic accident that resulted in a fatality be allowed to leave the country? What were the circumstances of that?
Well, this is all to come out in the next few days, George, and you use those words, be allowed, and I think those are the perfect words. The worst culprits in all this are the United States administration, well, the Trump administration, and we know from sources that he made this decision personally. He decided to play the diplomatic immunity card, which he contends that she has, we contend that she doesn't have, but he decided to whisk her away on the grounds that she had diplomatic immunity. Now, you understand this, George. The diplomatic immunity provisions are not a get-out-of-jail-free card. Diplomatic immunity does not mean diplomatic impunity. So the first decision that was made, and it was a gargantuan mistake, was to recall her and her family back to the United States roughly about 3 weeks after Harry died. But that's not the end of the story. It now is very clear that the authorities here in London, and by that I mean the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Number 10, effectively consented to her leaving when it was not their decision. That was a matter for Northamptonshire Police, the investigators, to delve into. And before they had the opportunity to do that, a decision was made in the Foreign Office, presumably with the blessing of Number 10, to allow her to leave.
And in the courts, you have, through the process of discovery, found emails which buttress that point of view, haven't you?
There is a very clear text message which has been disclosed to us. We don't know from whom, but it's described as a senior diplomat in the Foreign Office saying to the United States Embassy that they should feel free to put the Tsakoulis family on the next available flight home. They did say that they are not agreeing to the Americans' position, but they allowed her to leave.
These were not ordinary diplomats in the widely understood sense. Neither is the RAF base in question.
Quite.
Really an RAF base. It's an American base.
Correct.
And she and her husband were not, in fact, diplomats, but intelligence officers. What do you know about that?
Now, I am not an intelligence or security expert. I live about 3 miles away from RAF Croughton. What we've been told by sources here in London and in Washington, and you know when whistleblowers come out that there is a problem. So these are direct sources in both CIA and MI6 who are telling us in great detail what Jonathan Tsakoulis and Anne Tsakoulis do. I can sit here and describe to you in great detail what they do. They are both classified as technical intelligence officers. Anne Tsakoulis is more senior than her husband. She is a Russian speaker, a fluent Russian speaker, and she's a specialist in Russian affairs. Her job is to monitor what the Russians do. And apparently she does it very well, because shortly after she left and returned back to Washington, she was called to the White House, to the Oval Office, and feted in a ceremony and promoted a matter of weeks after Harry died. I don't know about you, George, but I get upset if I kill a rabbit on the road. Imagine getting on a plane, going back to Washington, as if nothing has happened, going to the White House, receiving a promotion. I personally would struggle to get out of bed for a very long time if I took another person's life.
You ended up in the White House. You're an American. Should have been a great day for you, being in the Capitol, in the White House itself. What happened?
We were in Manhattan doing interviews with, I think, NBC, when my phone rang, and it turned out to be from the Foreign Office, who were asking if it was okay for them to pass my phone number to the White House, who were trying to get in touch with me. I said, yeah, I'll speak to the White House, and when I did, we were invited to come down. We were asked, she asked, a senior person I was told, asked if we were free to make our way down to the White House later that day to meet with a senior government official. They wouldn't tell me who it was or what they wanted, but I put two and two together. A senior government official in the White House can only mean Donald Trump himself. So against my better judgment, we went down. George, we went through various security phases going into the White House. They did their best to try and isolate me from the family, because as you now know who I am, I'll confront anybody. But these people had lost their son 6 weeks ago, never been to the White House before, not used to working with politicians or presidents. They're entitled to representation. That's what people like me do. We look after vulnerable people. We eventually made our way through to the Oval Office. There was President Trump with several Secret Service type henchmen who looked like they could kill anybody with a flick of a finger. Very intimidating atmosphere. Mick Mulvaney, the Chief of Staff, was there. Stephen Mnuchin, the Treasury Secretary, was there. And a chap called Robert O'Brien, who's the National Security Advisor, head of the CIA. And after some initial exchanges and more, and he was fantastic at the beginning, made us feel very welcome. The atmosphere changed in a second, and he became very sinister. And then he uttered the words, "I've got the woman responsible in the next room. She feels terrible, and she wants to meet with you. And I want you to meet with her." And he's a very large, imposing man, bigger than me, imagine that, and physically very imposing. 4 times he said, "I really want you to meet her." And George, despite my physical size and my experience, I have to say, my heart was pounding. And I didn't know what to do, to be honest with you. And something went in my head, a switch went, and I jumped up and I said, "No, Mr. President, that's not why we're here." And I said, if If we ever meet Antsakoulis, it'll be back in the UK. And then Robert O'Brien, who was sitting next to President Trump in the Oval Office, started snapping and snarling at me. Almost, it seemed to me, my recollection is, that foam was coming out of his mouth. He was so angry. And he said to me, she is never going back, ever. Now, he was sitting right next to Charlotte, within a foot of Charlotte, snapping and snarling at me. But then Charlotte sort of took up the baton. She's only 5 foot tall, very diminutive, but the courage of a lion. And she then went on to explain to President Trump why it was so inappropriate for the family to meet the person who took their son's life 6 weeks earlier. We had started to talk about maybe a meeting between the two parties, which is a good idea. We have a system in this country, a restorative justice system that puts perpetrators and victims together, and sometimes good things happen. But it's always done through the court process, with mediators present, therapists present. You don't do that sort of thing to victims of a very serious crime in the Oval Office with the world's media all around you. George, I am an American. That should have been the proudest day of any American's life, to visit the White House, let alone the Oval Office, let alone meet the President of the United States. I dare say a very tiny percentage of Americans ever get to do that. It was a day that I'll never forget, and I'll never be more ashamed to be an American than I was that day.
Well, your friends are lucky to have you as a friend. Brad Sager, thanks for joining us on the Sputnik. Alas, that means we've come to the end of the show, but I hope you'll stay in touch with us on social media, and that if you enjoyed orbiting the world with me, George Galloway, on the Sputnik, you'll come back next week at the same time and the same place. Stay safe. It's been marvelous.